Here we are. I believe sincerely that I'm John Atack, and I'm led to believe that this is Chris Shelton, Master of Science.
Yeah, there. Yes, semi mastering, I suppose. With a flourish and a bow, I welcome you all here.
Prithee.
So hey everybody. So John and I were just talking a little bit beforehand about some stuff, some observations about. I don't know. I don't know that we have to name names, but it is certainly interesting to be out of Scientology for 10 years, John, significantly longer.
39 years.
Yeah. to watch the, I don't know, you don't want to be too judgy or whatever, but at the same time, it's just like, Jesus Christ, guys, there is an interesting set of people, and I have observed this not just in the ex-Scientology world. I'm not actually picking on any one person here, but it's really interesting how
we're picking on everybody.
It's interesting how different people will approach the subject of post-cult life, and how some few, and again, not just in the ex-Scientology world, will dig in their heels and will absolutely positively refuse to budge in their messaging. And so I ran, you run across some of these people when I first got out of Scientology 9-10 years ago, and got on social media, ran into certain folks, and were like, wow, these are guys who've been around for years, talking about Scientology, talking about the abuses. And you go, okay, good. Let's get on this train. Let's talk about this. Let's be a group of people. Maybe we can help each other. But over time, you start learning that there's some folks who aren't really about moving on, are not really about kind of, let's deal with this and heal from it. It's about just being mad and having targets to attack, and attacking and never really letting up. And because it's about attacking, it's like even after the target doesn't deserve their ire anymore, doesn't deserve, anything, they just keep going with the same lines. And I found myself connected with some people when I first got out of Scientology, and then kind of moved on, and okay, well, they're doing their thing, I'm going to do mine. And, you just kind of move on. And I have, and John and I mean, we talk about recovery and moving on and making change and
thriving survivors.
Yeah, and they're not really interested in thriving. They're kind of more into, no, this is all about this fight. And then the fight just becomes attacking each other. It becomes this sort of social drama of who's this week's enemy, who's this week's frenemy, and who's, this week's friend, and the same dramatis personae just keep filling all these different roles over time. And I come back to this, I got a little window into it just recently, and I'm like, it's the same people saying the same things they were saying 7, 8, 9 years ago. I'm not saying the same shit I was saying 7 or 8 or 9 years ago. And thank God, because some of the stuff I was saying 7 or 8 years ago was kind of ridiculous, So, and you live and you learn and you grow and you go, okay, yeah, let's be better than we were yesterday. And it's just remarkable how that doesn't happen universally. And I always feel it's a little bit of a shame,
Yeah, and it's symptomatic of trauma that where people have been traumatized, they will seek to traumatize others often. So, a proportion of abused children will go on to become abusers and feel that it's natural and normal behavior to be impolite, discourteous, and thoroughly nasty. And I think of it as traumatic rage. So, and you're right. I mean, looking at the, I spent a few years on the edge of the Jehovah's Witness ex-community, the apostates, as they call themselves. And I was horrified that it was so much of the communication was slagging off, forming into groups and attacking each other, rather than spending some time more time focusing on alerting the public to the abuses of Jehovah's Witnesses. And beyond that, understanding how they had remained involved, why they had remained involved, what it is in our psyches that attracts us and keeps us in such groups. I'm sure with the breaking up of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons, that the same thing is happening in that community, and it's tragic. I walked into it when I came back because back in the old days when there was just me and Jerry Armstrong and Larry Wallersheim and Bob Penny, before I exit counseled Vaughan and Stacey Young, imagine that long ago, and that was in 1993. But it was so much more peaceful, and my situation was ridiculous. I left Scientology because I absolutely believed in Ron Hubbard, and I absolutely did not believe in the people who were taking over. We didn't even know who they were. David Miscavige was first named publicly in 1983, shortly before I left, and he wasn't running it then. Hubbard was, in fact, still running it. I thought Hubbard was gone, and we'd got to save this stuff. And pretty soon, I was drenched with material about Hubbard's past, which proved beyond any reasonable doubt that he was a con man and a liar.
Yep.
And that was enough to bother me. And I then, that pretty soon led to me going, well, look, I can't estimate and analyze Scientology while I'm still inside it in my head. So I've got to put it down, and I'll take it back piecemeal and look at each principle one by one. So I've not adopted anything back in 39 years. I've never wanted to pick up the cans again. Every principle that seemed to have any value, as Hubbard says, you should look for the original source. And I did. And I wrote about them. There's a paper called Possible Origins for Dianetics and Scientology, which I think is a brilliant title. It's inspired. Russell Miller coming up with something like Barefaced Messiah. What a boring title. Oh, well, he got me there. But so the thing that astonished me was that I could, I remember, I'll say who it was. It was Vicky Ballard, who I liked. She was a friend. And she'd been the commanding officer of the St. Hill Foundation. And she was still absolutely hooked on this stuff. She later kind of turned state's evidence and went to the newspapers and told them things. But at this time, she was absolutely convinced, and she couldn't understand why I'd sort of gone, I don't want to do this anymore. I'll help you guys. I'll protect you from the mother cult. But I want to know how this worked. I want to know the history. I want to know the biography of Hubbard. And I opened those discussions. Steve Kent said that my work's the foundation of modern scholarship on Scientology. I mean, I'd look back to Roy Wallace before me and a few other people, but nobody had written a history of Scientology. Nobody's really added to it that much. Tony Ortega's done good work. Chris Owen's done good work. But the overview history, let's sell these people a piece of blue sky, remains. And its imitator, Inside Scientology, by Janet Reitman, of course, who admits in her reference notes that I'm where she got it all. First modern objective history of Scientology, as she called it. But I found myself in this conversation with Vicky Ballard, where I'm saying, look, in 1965, in my philosophy, we find that he's crippled and blinded with physical injuries to hip and back and injured optic nerves at the end of World War II. And yet here in Communication and Isness, the professional auditor's bulletin from the 1950s, we find him saying on July the 25th, 1945, I was feeling sorry for myself because I'd not qualified to be sent overseas. His time at the Princeton School of Military Government coming before that. And so I went down to Hollywood and got myself in a fight with 3 petty officers. And I sort of said to him, see, there's a bit of, without going into his various other accounts, where, for example, in Look magazine in 1950, where he said he had no war wounds or anything of the type. But how was it that from July the 25th to August the 14th and the end of the war, he'd become crippled and blinded? Because it certainly wasn't in combat. And how was he able, if he was crippled and blinded at the time, to overcome his injured optic nerves and beat up 3 petty officers? Now, there are apologists out there still who try to rationalize this and make some sense of it. But Vicky Ballard was immediate. She said he had two bodies. And I hadn't thought of that. I thought that's quite clever. And then I said to her, look, he wasn't wounded in combat. He never saw combat in World War II. I've read, his entire Navy file, all 800 pages of it. And there is no combat, unless you consider him shelling an uninhabited island off the Mexican coast.
That's right.
Los Coronados. Or his 55-hour battle with a magnetic deposit off Cape Lookout in Oregon. But I said to her, there's no combat. And she said, oh, yes, he did see combat. And I said, how do you know? And she said, I was with him in my last life. Now, it shocked me enough not to say, well, can you name any of the crew members? Can you name the ships? Can you tell us where this happened? It was just, and there was the problem right there. How can you make somebody see sense? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And you can lead a man to slaughter, but you can't make him think. And that became the conundrum for me. That became, so this is 1984 sometime. How do you solve that problem? And I spent, the next many years, certainly up until 91, trying to work out the history, the biography, because it's relevant to know what he actually did based upon what he actually said. I cite 150 different sources in Blue Sky. I think Janet Reitman has 7, one of which is me, one of which is Russell Miller. So 150 sources, books, articles, testimony, interviews I did. But the main contributor, more than half the book, is Ron Hubbard. It's his work. It's him saying these things. And there are 1,200 reference notes in the book. So anybody can go and check my sources and see if what I'm saying is true. But why is it? And eventually I came to cognitive dissonance, Leon Festinger's incredible work, which most people don't know was actually his published book, When Prophecy Fails, which is a wonderful and highly readable book, is actually based on the career of a Scientologist. So he was studying a woman who was a trance medium, but was also a Scientologist. So she had a live-in Scientology auditor looking after her while she was channeling, I think he's called Santananda, from another planet. And he says, right, you've got to get all the followers to the hilltop because the world's going to end. And we need the mothership to come and rescue you great people, the 20 or so of you. And Festinger had already infiltrated 2 people into her group. You could do things like that back in the 50s. Ethical committees didn't stop you. So he got 2 graduate students in her group, lying low or laying low, one or the other. And he predicted that those of her followers who went to the hilltop would continue to believe when the mothership didn't show up. I don't know how he knew that the mothership wasn't going to show up, but, maybe just a guess,
Probably just a lucky guess. Yeah, probably.
And
so let me back up a second. Did I hear you right that this woman who was connected with this doomsday cult group was also getting Scientology auditing?
Yeah, she had a live-in auditor and she was the head of the group. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, because that's definitely a new piece of information for me. So that is fascinating.
Yeah, and so of course her thinking was, to a large extent conditioned by Ron Hubbard.
Right.
But we will perhaps next time get into the intricacies of the hundreds of splinter groups from Scientology. People like Eckankar, Darfree, John, Est, so many significant groups of reevaluation co-counseling, which the Open University, the largest university in the world, used for about 20 years. And it's Harvey Jackins, and who claimed he'd never heard of Dianetics, and yet there are photographs of him shaking hands with Ron Hubbard, who's giving him a certificate, But so there was all that stuff going on. But my fascination was this cognitive dissonance, this idea that if somebody believes something fervently enough, then the more evidence you provide, the firmer their belief will become. And that's what we're seeing in these groups, that they are enraged by what happened to them, and having talked with a number of the people who are engaged in these battles, I can understand why. You know, they experience terrible things. But rather than healing from those terrible things and then helping others to heal, which is, I think, has been more your approach, they have created a kind of, I called, when we were talking before, I called it a piranha pool, where sides are taken and allegations are hurled and grand conspiracy theories are entertained. And it's a loathsome, awful place. And it's why cults flourish to a large extent, because people do become fervent, grab onto an idea, and then, you know, push that idea out. And in this case, we've seen so many weird independent groups. I mean, Tony Ortega keeps his ear to the ground and reports occasionally on some of the more serious absurdities of these groups. And we've seen so much hatred, so much, you know. I remember years ago talking with Otto Rose, who was the first, he was one of only 5 people trained to the highest level, class 12 by Hubbard. And he was the only person to do OT8 before 1988, under Hubbard's direction. And so, and he was Hubbard's auditor, he was Hubbard's case supervisor and all of this. And he was still a fervent believer. He was still, although he didn't tell them what he was doing, his staff in his various organizations around the world were all receiving Scientology auditing. He was very glad when the ability meter came out that he didn't have to tape over the word Hubbard on the dial of his e-meter anymore, you know, and got a meter that worked properly, you know, but in comparison to the crappy Scientology ones. But so Otto, you know, so his attitude to Scientology and mine were very different, but we were good friends. He thought it was absolutely wonderful. I think it's a way of psychologically and physically enslaving people.
Yep.
That's my experience. And he said the bad thing about Scientology, having worked with Hubbard very closely for about 8 years, he said the bad thing about Scientology is it erodes compassion. And you go, once you've done that, are there any good things? Because if you've done that to a human being, what have you got? A narcissist, a sociopath, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that is what tends to happen, that people become abusive, authoritarian, bullying, and then they leave, and that's all still going on in their heads. And they need, I mean, the meta psychologists, and I gave them their name. That's one of the many achievements of my life, was that I suggested to Sarge Gabodi that he call his organization meta psychology, using Freud's term. I just opened a book in his library and there was the word, you know, it's no deep thinking. But I think they still call it traumatic incident reduction. And what we're seeing instead is traumatized people production. We're seeing, you know, these people who so have tremendous compassion and even sympathy, that outlawed emotion in Scientology. I don't think it is actually an emotion as such, but I have tremendous sympathy for people who've been involved with Scientology. But come on, guys, stop bickering and do something good in the world for a change.
I know, right?
And finally, Benjamin Franklin said, we either hang together or we hang separately. And while, as Aaron Smith Levin points out, excuse me, when I talk with him, he was like, well, what are they going to do to you? And it's like, you want to hear what they do to you? I had 16 years solid of harassment from this group on a daily basis, 10 lawsuits, private detectives, 4 people in my personal circle who were reporting on me, you know, and had, you know, all of this, you know, 2 break-ins, people stealing stuff from me. What can they do to you? With a couple of $1 billion, they can do quite a lot to you.
That's right.
And Aaron's perspective was different because now there are, you know, we mentioned the late and somewhat eccentric Arnie Lerma in our preludium conversation. And Arnie, when asked for a puff for my book, said, before the internet and safety in numbers, there was John Atack. And now there are thousands, literally thousands of people speaking out against Scientology, which is great. But I support what you're doing, which is to analyze and understand this problem and help people who've been affected by it and understand the broader connotation of authoritarianism. Hearing people snarking about their time in Scientology and telling the same story that they told me 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they've not healed. They've not healed. And that's an awful thing.
Exactly. And I think I could not agree with you more about that. And I look at it from my perspective of, I talk an awful lot about emotional needs. That's a very important framing for me to understand psychologically what's going on with people, because it's not just about critical thinking and coming to, some conclusions or some ideas, about this leads me to think that maybe some people are going to cloak themselves in that cognitive dissonance, and it's so comfortable, it's so appealing for them, it provides such answers or security or comfort to them for whatever reason that they just can't let it go. They just can't let it go, even though they're angry and on tirades all the time and seem to be these little hate monsters. It's really coming out of this, this insecurity and this sort of like, this problem. And I think that there's something, I think there's something really awful when we look at Scientology specifically in regards to this and the history of any Scientologist, because what is it doing? As you mentioned, it's psychological enslavement, right? It's like we've broken this down in talking about brainwashing a couple of weeks ago and thought reform, and what is it that's actually happening there? Well, you deprive somebody of enough food, enough sleep for over a short enough period of time, you can get them to say and think just about anything you want. You add physical deprivation on there, and punishment drive and trauma bonding, where you're rewarding and punishing, and then you reward a little bit and you punish some more, and you can get somebody into a pretty bad place. But the bottom thing on that, or at least the way I think about it, is there's also another little thing being trained in there. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this. And it has to do with that certainty thing. Oh, yes. Scientology, right? It's all about science of certainty. And we're going to be positively sure. We're going to know something, and we're going to know it so well. We're going to have it with such certainty that we will never, ever have to ever entertain the idea of questioning our rightness, our inherent goodness, our intent, because we're on this path of such incredible meaning, of such incredible purpose, saving the world, becoming gods, which really is what Scientology is promising. It's promising godhood, not a small order, right? Not a small goal. When people who get into Scientology are going for it in the biggest way possible. And even if you're not all about the godhood, even if you're like, well, I didn't really believe that. Well, what is in Scientology? What does it offer you? Power and influence over others, the ability to dominate other people, especially in the Sea Org.
Using magic, fundamentally, using your intentions to control other people without their consent.
Exactly. Tone 40, right? Intention without reservation. You will be the one in the driver's seat, and everybody else, as L. Ron Hubbard wrote in his own affirmations, everybody else will be your slave. Right. And there are people,
his slaves.
Yeah, his slaves, right? I mean, that was really what it was all about.
Yeah.
And people get into this. And so maybe not everybody who gets involved is about the altruistic messaging of saving the world. Maybe some people get into this because, for maybe more selfish reasons. And those for them are very valid, right? But what does it do, whether it's that person or whether it's somebody like a you or a me? It's still giving us this base of certainty that, you know what, everything you think is right. Everything you think, it's true because you thought it.
What's true for you is true.
Right, exactly. It's building on that base, right? And it's building it through psychological manipulation, through propaganda techniques, through thought reform. I mean, all the different stuff, but it's building this sort of foundation of certainty, unreasonable certainty.
But
And
not in the L. Ron Hubbard redefinition of the term unreasonable.
no, not that definition. But it is an unreasonable certainty because it's an unthinking, unquestioning, unassailable certainty.
I think,
and I think people come out stuck in that.
Oh, and how?
And it takes a long ass time to break that down. And there's people who you just don't have their cooperation in breaking it down. They don't want to give that up. I don't know that they would even think about it that way. But what do you think?
I think you're right. They don't frame it that way because they have cognitive dissonance. Now, right. I personally love cognitive dissonance. I'm old enough and foolish enough to have realized that when I start feeling uneasy about something that somebody is saying, there is a challenge for me. And the challenge, what we normally do is bat it away, say you're wrong because of this, cut them up on some details or, find some way around what they're saying, which I frequently did as a Scientologist when, friends and relatives were concerned about my involvement. I didn't use thought stopping. I didn't chant something to myself to not hear them. I took on their arguments head on. So, when Christopher Evans wrote Cults of Unreason, and as a Scientologist, I read what I wanted to read. So I read that. I read, various texts along the way. Roy Wallace's Road to Total Freedom, what have you. And in reading Christopher Evans, he said, well, L. Ron Hubbard seems to have become disinterested in Scientology in this period. So I just went to the tech volumes and the policy volumes and went, well, he's wrong. He was still interested. But again, what does it matter whether he was interested or not? He then criticizes Hubbard as a science fiction writer. And of course, Evans himself would later be a successful science fiction writer. So the idea that you can't trust somebody. So you're looking at the peripheral stuff rather than, is it screwing people up? Is it, does Scientology cause better relationships in the world? Does it actually cause a more ethical approach towards humanity? And what you said about, the motivation for people becoming involved, there are a number of groups of people who'll be vulnerable, but one group are seekers, such as myself. I came from Buddhism and was interested in mysticism in the proper sense of the word, not the popular sense. And another group will be salespeople and con artists. And I've known so many Scientologists who fitted into that particular category. But we come to it. I was, I think, a reasonably compassionate human being when I arrived. And what will then happen is, even if you do have the best motivation, you're not seeking to be a god so you can blow up your enemies or the people who've annoyed you, but you're doing it for the good of mankind, it will erode compassion. You'll have no sympathy towards people. You'll fundamentally become a hardcore Republican. You'll become somebody who thinks that everything that happens to you is your own responsibility and that you've got to look after it. The state and anybody else shouldn't be involved. There should be no welfare. And
exactly.
Right. I mean, Hubbard took it to the extreme in Science of Survival, where he's pretty much saying there should be no democracy, that the only people who should have the vote are Scientologists.
That's right. That's right. And he did actually say that. That was not, we're not exaggerating with that. He was very clear that clears should be the people deciding things, right? And us riffraff, and those people in the 1-1 band and anybody who's got a physical deformity. I mean, he was ready to start loading people in the trains. It's really, and it's not hard to find it. It's right there in the text.
Yeah, anybody below 2.0 antagonism on his emotional tone scale should not have the right to vote.
Yep.
And then you go on to the more hidden doctrine in Scientology, which is that everybody who is not a Scientologist is below 0 on the tone scale.
Yes.
Below death. I mean, this is a man who said that hiding was an emotion, and it was at -8, and he spent most of his life doing it.
Exactly. And it's all predicated on this very twisted. I mean, it's so manipulative. It is such a subtle. I mean, when you think about it, when we put it in these terms, it's not subtle, but I'll tell you, when I was at the receiving end of it, it sure was. And it's this subtle manipulation of, you're so screwed up, you don't even know how screwed up you are, but you sure are lucky to have arrived at our door, because we're going to unscrew you, and we're the only ones who can.
If you knew what was wrong with you, it wouldn't be wrong with you.
There you go.
So if you've got a broken leg, you don't know it.
And the broken leg, or maybe you do know you have a broken leg, but what's really wrong is your headache that you don't know about, right?
Yeah. And you've got the broken leg because of something you don't know about, which is a motivator. It's a motivator because you committed an overt, and around and around we go. There is, so much on this. The Conway and Siegelman, in their interesting study of cult snapping, I don't agree with their conclusions. But I do think they provide a tremendous amount of insight. So, they're worth reading. And they said that Scientology has the most debilitating set of rituals of any group in America. Words to that effect. They may have used the word cult, in fact, rather than group. But the most debilitating set of rituals. And the recovery from the Krishnas, the Moonies, 3 months, 6 months. Recovery from Scientology, 12.5 years.
Yep.
I was in touch with them. That was, they first published in 78. The new edition was 1990. I was in touch with them 5 or 6 years ago. And I said, the 12.5 years was a guess, right? I said, yeah. Said, the reality is that most people won't recover, because Scientology has built into it the reinforcement. So if you went through a Chinese brainwashing camp and you're not in China anymore, it'll all evaporate. So you have to either put people into an environment that reinforces their belief, or make it self-reinforcing.
There it is.
I talked a little bit about this with Steve Hassan last week, and this, the training routine 0, staring at people. You do that, it puts you into a state of mind. And that state of mind, it took me, I had 9 years in Scientology. It took me 6 months to get rid of the predator stare. 6 months, because it was I was so used to the locked on eye contact, and didn't understand that it intimidates people. It's not a healthy form of counseling, but it puts you into a state of mind. And the thing I especially noticed was that by not staring at people, I noticed a lot more about them. The staring is an internal state where, we get the Ganzfeld effect, where, you start to see things moving and colors and all of that, and you don't think straight. And it's one of many techniques. I mean, the idea of asking a question, that you're meant to do that flip at that you're conditioned into behaving in certain ways, so that your own internal reality, the way you interpret the world, is changed.
That's right.
And that persists. It doesn't just go away when you say, I'm no longer a Scientologist. It persists. And it's kind of interesting, because I've really got on a soapbox in the last couple of years about the internal enemy. This idea that you've got demons, body thetans, or an unconscious mind, or an id, or something that you don't know about that's inside you. And I think this is a terrible deception. There isn't an agent inside you. There isn't a person or a being inside you, invisible to you, directing your actions, as Scientology and Catholicism and so many other things teach. The Tibetans do it too with their Gedons, and the Jews have dibuks, and the Muslims have genies or jinns. All of these little beings that are meant to be. These don't exist, but processes, unconscious processes, routines that have been set up, ways of thinking, neural pathways, if we want to get into the sound clever about it. That stuff all does exist. And if you don't look at it and understand it, there isn't a way of overcoming it. You can't hypnotize yourself out of believing these things. You want to look at the beliefs and say, is this true?
Exactly. Exactly. I couldn't have put that better myself. Or absolutely, for sure. In fact, I'll add to that that I think that is one of the reasons that you see in Scientology specifically so much stress by Hubbard on the training side of Scientology, not just on the auditing side. There are two paths. There are two aspects of the path. It is a singular path to the brainwashing or mind control of Scientology, and that is learning Scientology and then having Scientology applied to you through the processes of auditing. And both are necessary to get the full effect of Scientology, which is that self-reinforcing mechanism where you are taught to believe the world is a certain way. There's a duality in your mind, for example. There's a reactive mind, and there's you, the thetan or the analytical mind.
Yeah.
Right? And this duality exists, and there is a triumvirate of mind, body, spirit. And this mind is separate from you, and the body is not you. You are this other thing, which cannot be seen, felt, or experienced or measured in any way, except through physical, its effects on the physical world.
Can you measure a dog by its biscuits, as L. Ron Hubbard so sagely put it? Yeah.
Yeah, you're basically called upon to have faith in this concept. And it's a fundamental axiom one. It's the very first thing in Scientology that you have to take on faith in order for the rest of it to make any sense. And as long as you buy into that principle, everything else becomes a lot easier to buy into. It's a series of agreements you're buying into. And they're trained into you. And even the training process, the TRs, the staring you were talking about, right? That we've gone on about. The misunderstood word thing, about all the stress on words, and just so many mechanisms are installed through the training, and even training is hypnotizing you in a way, or it's putting you into this altered state of being, we could say. And Gansfield effect is one aspect of this. Openness to suggestibility is another one I will dare say I will put out there, right? Because
accepting directions from a person who is considered to be authoritative. Hubbard himself explained this in some detail. When you give somebody altitude over you, they become a hypnotic operator. Those are his words. So once you believe somebody is an authority, then you won't think about the instruction they're giving you. So this opens up so much. There is so much here for both of us to say, I think, from our experience and our reading.
Yes.
But I think the essential point, if there is one simple thing that everybody in the world could understand, that would be the nature of feelings of knowing, feelings of certainty. William James, who will always be relevant to this conversation, called the father of modern psychology, and he is certainly one of them, one of the really important people. Absolute genius, a remarkable man who, for any atheist watching this, actually had all sorts of spiritual beliefs and was a founder of both the British and American societies for psychical research. And there's a great book called Ghost Hunters about James and the foundation of those societies and the work they did, which almost had me believing, so quite amazing. But one of the things he put forward this concept that he calls noesis, N-O, two dots, E-S-I-S. The two dots is to say that you say the two vowels separately, noesis rather than gnosis. See, we learn something new every minute. But his idea is that there is actual certainty, possibly, but most of what we consider to be absolutely true comes from the feeling that it is true. And when we examine it, there may be no evidence whatsoever for that belief. This is where Ron Hubbard is putting you. Your internal reality says, Ron Hubbard is right. What would Ron do? And you go, well, he'd grab the money and run away. That's an easy question to answer. What would Ron do?
That's right.
That's what he did his whole life. But
That's right.
so we find ourselves with that conundrum that, and you saw me at Toronto in 2015 I've been doing it ever since. I have one story from when I was 17, and I spent 2 hours, who knows, discussing the Gospels with a born-again Christian who had stopped me on the street for this purpose. And as he backed away from me to make sure I didn't jump on his back and rip him to pieces, and I was perfectly courteous and polite to him, but I confused him a little bit. And he walked away from me, backed away, and he said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. Now, that is a feeling of certainty.
That's it. That's it right there. And that is what you gain power from in Scientology. There's social credit for that. There's, in that you gain the admiration of your fellows, you gain money, you gain influence with people to the degree that you are buying into all of this and saying with such surety that it's all true. Who in Scientology, certainly when you and I got in, who was more revered than an OT?
Mm.
The OTs were the gods.
And if anybody would like to revere me, I am OT5, by the way. So I am deserving of a significant amount of reverence, I think.
Well, okay, John. But isn't it interesting how you can switch that culturally within Scientology, and yet the same emotions are still at play? Because now OTs are still highly regarded. Auditors are almost completely disregarded in today's Scientology culture. They used to be also considered gods walking amongst us, right? Especially the class 8s. If you were a class 12, you were like, I mean, there were a handful of those. I never even met. I met like
there were 56 of them.
Yeah, in all the years I was in Scientology, I met like 1 or 2.
Yeah.
But now it's all about financial status, right? Oh, who's contributed the most, right? Now those are the gods who walk amongst us in the Scientology world. The Duggins and the Grant Cardones and the Michael Chans and these guys who are revered for their ability to make money. It's all just raw money now.
Yeah, but money is the measure of spirituality and goodness, isn't it, Chris?
Well, that's what they'll tell you. And Grant Cardone will certainly translate money equals success and money equals certainty. And it's because I'm so certain and I'm so tone 40, I'm so on it, right? I mean, this is the standard tech bro sales pitch for crypto and get rich sales techniques and the multi-level marketing. This is far from just a Scientology thing. But it is this, but this point really needs to be made that you've made and harped on a bit more of, it's an emotional place. It's not a knowledge place. That's surety, that's certainty. It's empowering. And there's a certain point where it should be, but then there's a point where it gets dialed up too far, where it can't ever be questioned, where your emotional need has gotten to a place where if it's wrong or if it's somehow proven to be wrong or if it's questioned in some way, somehow you feel the person, taking this too far feels that it somehow threatens their very identity, their themselves as a person or their value or their worth. Right? It threatens it if you take it away from them or question it somehow. And
Mom, Dad, and apple pie are all threatened.
That's right. And
that's what Hubbard said.
Where it goes too far. So, so isn't it interesting how all the techniques of Scientology, if you're going to kind of, do a super reductionist here, I mean, there's lots and lots of control techniques, but so much of what Scientology is about is trying to manipulate you unreasonably into that exact emotional place.
And a significant way of doing that is the double bind. The idea of the two-terminal universe, that everything is reduced to positive and negative, black and white. And perversely, of course, in the appendix to Science of Survival in 1951, Hubbard talks about the different forms of logic. So there's single-valued logic, which is the will of God. We could also substitute for that the will of Ron. Single-valued logic, you do what Ron says. Then you have dual-valued logic, where you've got the terminals. And then he talks about multi-valued logic, which he probably got from Korzybski. That's probably this idea of shades of grey, and there are more than 50, by the way.
Yes, infinite number. Yes.
Yeah, infinity valued logic, which is never spoken about again. And so you've got this incredible situation where you've got the very thing that he is most significantly criticizing, single valued logic. You just do as you're told, authoritarianism, slavery, mental and physical, that it becomes, you will become absolutely self-determined as long as you agree with everything I think and say. You'll be thinking and saying completely independently when you do exactly what you're told. And that is the foundation of Scientology.
That's it.
To make you into what was, you know, it's rather nasty, but what was called for some time a rondroid. Could have been called androns, you know, you could have gone the other way with it. But this concept of zombifying people, of taking away their freedom of choice, and you know, and the contradiction is writ large in the code of the Sea Org member, because you promise to follow and uphold command intention.
I promise to uphold, forward, and carry out command intention. Point 1. That's right.
For 1,000 million years, after which I will be allowed to become self-determined. Oh, exactly. And here you were in Dianetics saying anybody can do this in a month. And now it's like, I've got to do what? 1,000 million years, and then you'll let me go. And I can be my own person again, because of all the desperation of clearing the planet, the galaxy, the universe, which they're not doing very well with. I also have frequently pointed out that what's true for you is true, which is kind of postmodernism. You know, when postmodernism, when that moves away from being a way of a method of literary deconstruction and becomes a view of life, it's like, well, what I think about gravity is as important as what Einstein thinks about gravity. I don't understand special relativity or general relativity, but my opinion's as good as his. So we have a democracy of opinion instead of a science. Now, what's true for you is true. What a ridiculous nonsense. It doesn't make something true just because you choose to believe it. Because you choose to believe in that Eric Cartman is really the tooth fairy, which I do believe, by the way. It doesn't make it so. Because you believe in Santa Claus, it doesn't make it so. And because you believe L. Ron Hubbard is the savior of mankind, he proved he wasn't. He absolutely proved it, because in Hypnosis, where he says, am I Maitreya? The answer is no. The Book of the Great Decease, which is the only Buddhist original text which talks about Maitreya or Maitreya, the future Buddha, says he will save all of mankind and take us into nirvana, or nibbana if you prefer the Pali and don't want to think about Kurt Cobain. He will take us all into nibbana. He didn't. He died. It's done. He wasn't Maitreya. So we still, and all of the stuff in there about, you know, the prophecy of him having red hair, being born in the West, it being 2,500 years after the Buddha, those are lies. That was the first thing I checked in the first week I got into Scientology. I wrote to the Pali Text Society because I was Buddhist. And they said, no, there isn't. Since then, I've read the Book of the Great Decease. There is no such prophecy. What's more, the original text of Hymn of Asia didn't read, am I Maitreya? The man who put it together, John Sanborn, when I interviewed him, he said, Hubbard gave me this in 1954 and said, publish it. And I wouldn't, because it said, I am Maitreya. And eventually in the 70s, he twigged it, if he just switched it to a question, that he could publish this rather peculiar, you know, if you see me dead, I will then live forever, but you will see a world in flames. Well, that didn't prove to be true either. Not quite yet. There have been some bad forest fires since he died, but a world in flames, a bit of an exaggeration.
A bit of an exaggeration, exactly. And so much so, interestingly, that Hymn of Asia is a property you cannot buy at a Church of Scientology anymore. They've quietly retired that one. And it's not a
The
lot.
world will end in 1914. The world will end in 1917. The world will end.
Yeah.
I think it's 2033 currently for the Jehovah's Witnesses. But yeah,
Yeah.
but the origin of what's true for you is true. He says this is a Buddhist idea, and it took me a little while to figure out. He's talking about the Kalama Sutta, where the Buddha says,
Not
don't
the
believe.
Kama Sutra.
No, not the Karma Sutra, but the Kalama Sutta. What a dirty mind you have.
Of course I went there.
It's not a perfumed garden. It's not a sex book, you know. The Buddha's sex book, you know. But again, in Buddhism, you've got Tantra. And I'm sure the Buddha would go, what? You know, you can have sex to become enlightened. Well, there's a wishful piece of thinking. It's like, you know, you can sit and eat fish and chips until you explode on the toilet like Elvis Presley. But, you know, there are different religious practices, different people. The Kalama Sutta, and we'll probably stick a link to it somewhere. Basically, the Buddha says, don't believe what your parents tell you. Don't believe what your teachers tell you. Don't believe what the priests tell you. Don't believe what a spirit whispers in your ear. Don't believe what the gods tell you. Don't believe what I tell you. Check it out. And so Hubbard's got this, well, you know, think it through for yourself and it'll be true because you believe it's true. The Buddha was more inclined towards a more scientific way of looking at the world. Check it, test it, observation, experiment, not just, oh, that feels right, I'll believe it. You know, which is,
well, isn't it interesting that the same guy, because you mentioned double binds earlier, so I got to say this while it's still on my mind, is yes, yeah. here's exactly the attitude, and almost word for word what you just said is something Hubbard said in a few lectures in the early days. He wasn't saying this shit later on, but early on he was saying, you know, take it or leave it, you know, here's the knowledge. And it was Scientology and Effective Knowledge lecture where he talked about this. He said that, you know, ever since when Buddha came around, you know, it was this philosophical approach, and it was a take it or leave it. You don't have to, you know, I'm not going to ram this down your throat. And he said, ever since then, ever since the Buddha said that stuff, we've had all these institutions and all these organizations and the Christian church and all this stuff who absolutely positively are not that way. They will shove it down your throat every chance they get. And Scientology is the one thing that comes along since Buddha to say the same thing and adopt this philosophy. And I have to point
20th century Buddhism.
Yeah, exactly. But then we have to point out the very obvious fact that Hubbard's just created another goddamn double bind, because here he is talking about freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of belief. Take it or leave it. If you want it, if it's true for you, it's true. If it's not true for you, screw it. And he takes this kind of, you know, laissez-faire sort of whatever approach. And then he contrasts that with the definition of ethics. The purpose of ethics is to remove any counter intention from the environment. And once that's accomplished, to remove any other intentionness from the environment. In other words, if you're thinking anything counter to what Scientology is all about, or if you're thinking anything other than what Scientology is all about, you're off the goddamn rails, you're out ethics, and we're going to punish you with this long list of crimes. I'm not even exaggerating. That's exactly what it says. This is called a double bind. It's one is, you know, you have one value over here and you have the exact opposite value or rule being expressed over here, and you're stuck in the middle. You figure out how this makes sense. It doesn't make sense. It binds you in the cognitive dissonance of trying to make it make sense, and you can't really ever resolve it. And that is the anatomy of crazy making. That's how you create psychosis.
Absolutely. And the point is that if you're given conflicting instructions, it will paralyze you.
Right.
And I mean, this is the one Hubbard quotation I cannot find. And I've talked with so many people about it, but I remember reading him explaining, and I thought it was in the false purpose rundown materials where he's saying, you know, if you have conflicting ideas, you won't know what to do, and you'll go to an authority source to tell you what to do. So, and that in Scientology is is fundamental. The conflict with Buddhism and the proof, absolute, that Scientology is not a form of Buddhism appears, as far as I know, in only one paragraph. And that paragraph is Route 2, Process 47, certainty.
R247?
Yeah. So, sorry, it's called separateness. And it's in the creation of human ability. And he says that this is the process that proves that we are not a single mass of theta, but that we are individuals. Now, the fundamental principle upon which all of Buddhism, even if you're like me and you don't, you think that Mahayana and Theravadim are not the same thing at all. Mahayana is not a form of Buddhism. I don't care what people say. It's not what the Buddha taught. But putting that aside, we can talk about that some other time. The fundamental principle, the enlightenment that leads you to nirvana, is the realization of anatta, which is there is no self. Hubbard is asserting in R247 there is a self. So it isn't Buddhism. It isn't about the dissolution of the self. In fact, it's about the elevation of the self. It's about creating narcissists, and sociopaths. So
yeah.
So we would,
and isn't that, and I think we're talking here about, we're describing and giving examples here of the double bind, that it's crazy making, it's paralysis inducing, it's hypnotic, which is really kind of the fundamental thing here that we're talking about is how do we, when we talk about Scientology being hypnotic, when we talk about it using hypnotic techniques, what are we talking about? Well, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about a stopwatch in front of somebody's eyes and you were feeling sleepy. That is not the kind of hypnotic induction we're talking about in Scientology. Nope. We're talking about this kind of thing, because you're trying to create a state of mind where a person is suggestible, where they are manipulatable. And if you throw this kind of crap at people, you get them all stirred up in a cognitive dissonant state, then you are to that degree controlling them. You're manipulating them. And you're
directing their thoughts, their beliefs, and therefore their activities, the things that they will do, which is make as much money as they can to give to Ron Hubbard, which is the fundamental flow of Scientology.
That's right.
Let's get into the meat of this. That one of the most dangerous words in our language, or two of the most dangerous words, hypnosis and hypnotism, because everybody knows what they mean, and so they don't have to think. They are what are called thought-terminating cliches by Robert J. Lifton, because it's that Svengali Trilby image of the watch, and that stuff does work. There is some efficacy. We've put up the Captive Minds Hypnosis and Beyond video, which has shows that the fashions of the early 1980s were pretty huge lapels and what have you, but it's got some very interesting material in it showing what stage hypnosis or deep trance hypnosis is. Everybody's an orchestra, everybody's a chicken, this kind of stuff. And that does exist. There are a percentage of people who will respond immediately. Hypnotists, stage hypnotists, you'll often see this. They'll check for somebody's susceptibility.
That's
and
right.
Once they've sorted the person out who can be put into this state of mind, which I think people wrongly call trance, they will usually just touch them here and away they will go. Faith healers do it, speaking of stage hypnotists. But what do we actually mean by this thing? That the word hypnosis was devised by a man called James Braid, who was a Scottish doctor in the 1840s, I think, somewhere around there. It's not that it hadn't been done. The Hindu traditions and the Muslim traditions have practices, and the Buddhist traditions have practices that we would call hypnotherapy that go back centuries. But it only seemed to erupt in the West when Anton Mesmer came along and told people about animal magnetism, this magnetic stuff that you could get people to do these crazy things. We've already mentioned Benjamin Franklin. He was on the committee that found Mesmer to be a fraud, which was unfortunate because, in fact, Mesmer had touched on something that would become very interesting. Braid comes along and looks at this, and he calls it hypnosis. And hypnos means sleep. He thought it was a sleep state. It isn't. We now have neural imaging that shows that in the states that we would call hypnotic, that people would call trance, quite different things are going on in the brain from what happens during sleep, and quite different things from what happens in other states. So let me put forward, I think I disagree with everybody on this topic. I've tried to understand it. When I left Scientology, I think it was probably Bandler and Grinder, the founders of neuro-linguistic programming, an interesting set of devilish techniques, that it was their book, Frogs into Princes. Various of my friends, 3 of my friends, went and did NLP courses, and I was fascinated by the negative transformation of all 3 of them. And it was no doubt there were people I knew, and doing those courses was harmful to them. It made them less compassionate. Again, it made them more selfish. And indeed, one of the 3 friends realized that and stopped doing it as a consequence. But reading Frogs into Princes by Bandler and Grinder introduced me to this world of hypnosis. And the first realization was that whatever word we used to describe this, I'd been highly trained to do this on the auditor courses I'd done. And there is a rumor, and it was bounced back at me just the other week, that I did no training in Scientology. And I'd just like to make it clear that I did 6 major auditor courses. And, I'm a class 2 auditor. I'm a Dianetic auditor. I'm a method 1 auditor. I have certificates to prove it. I also did the data series evaluators course, which is the big one, and very few people do. And I realized that
those are all major courses. I've done them. I agree. Yeah.
I had 9 years of doing this and reading extensively in Hubbard literature, more than is on the courses. And I realized I'd been highly trained to manipulate people. I'd been trained to put them into states of mind that would make them more manipulable. Now, the simplest one of these, I object to the term altered state, which is so commonly used. The book by Charles Tart, which was a major reason that hypnosis started to be studied again in the 60s and is an excellent book, is called Altered States. Now, for a state to be altered, you'd have to have a basic resting state first. There'd be a state that you were in, and all of the other states would be altered from that state. That's not how we work. We have many different states of consciousness. And it isn't as complicated as it seems. So our emotions are states of consciousness. We view the world, when we're elated in one way, when we're terrified or angry in another. Now, Hubbard listed these, but didn't really explain what he was up to, oddly enough, in manipulating our emotions and getting us to mimic emotions, getting us to pretend to be angry and pretend to, go above somebody on the tone scale or below them, to manipulate them into the emotional level you want, particularly when you're recruiting them and you want to get fear of, the need for change and the idea, fear of worsening. That's the one you really want to hit, the ruin that this will just get worse and worse. So it's manipulation. It's a way of changing somebody's state so that they meet you on the street and you talk with them and you want to bring them down. You want to get them in an emotional state where they are vulnerable and can be recruited. That's what it's about. I was never willing to do that. I would not take somebody's tone down. That seemed to me wrong and manipulative. But it's part of the dissemination drill. It's part of how it's meant to be done. So these states of mind, among them is elation, euphoria, call it what you will. And this is a non-rational state. When oh, wow, man, it's really fantastic. I'm really high. That's absolutely great. You ain't thinking straight.
Yeah.
Now, it's okay to be elated. You know, I was saying that yesterday I saw a wonderful polyphonic choral performance in a church with 8 singers singing all this stuff. I was elated. It was fantastic. But I didn't have to sign any away any money. I'd paid for my ticket. And I didn't have to give my devotion to the singers afterwards and enslave myself to them. I was able to just enjoy it and walk away. The end phenomena of Scientology processes, almost all of them, is a cognition, some sort of insight or revelation, and very good indicators, meaning elation, meaning euphoria. This is a standard effect of hypnosis. Of it, you know, somebody can get you into a state where you're euphoric. You won't think as well as you do. You know, it won't be cool, calm reasoning anymore. So it's time to write your success story, which is a way of rigidifying the belief that you've achieved something, you know, by making a testimonial. It's a well-known psychological form that once you've committed to an idea, you've got to stick with it. And
That's
then
right.
we'll take you to the registrar and get some more money out of you. So there's this process of getting people high. Now, I realized after a significant amount of inquiry that Hubbard's got this little trick going on that works. Faith healers do this too. You will get the adrenaline surge, the opioid release. You know, if you want to get, it might have something to do with serotonin, though that's been highly questioned in the last year. It might have something to do with oxytocin. That too has been highly questioned. So it could be brain chemicals. We can put it off on that and sound like we're clever. But the reality is you get high and then you want to get high again because that's what junkies do. And that's what Scientology is. That's also what the traumatized rage process is. People who just keep on attacking somebody. It's making them feel superior. It's making them.
That's where we were going earlier with that whole certainty thing, is when you are hepped up on that emotion of certainty, that is arrogance.
Yeah.
That's a description of what that word means at an emotional level, is such certainty that you can't even fathom the idea that you could be questioned or that you could be wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And this becomes self-righteousness. I'm all for the idea of righteousness.
That's right.
That's
right. And try to fight back against that when somebody's in that headspace, right? It's hard. It's hard to engage with somebody in that headspace, whether it's a rage-filled or an awe-filled. It's still that emotional center of no, there is nothing about what I'm thinking right now that could possibly be wrong. And the added benefit of the state is it's incapable of questioning itself.
Yeah.
This is why I talk about it. Critical thinking just takes a back seat here. It's not even in the picture because of that emotional center of it feels so goddamn good to be right. And it's playing on one of the most fundamental aspects of our entire existence, which is that survive, that being right is about getting into the future successfully.
Yeah.
It's all goal oriented in that direction, even if you're not necessarily wording it or thinking about it that way. That's what it's feeding. If you want, it's, you know, we look at it and we go, my God, how could somebody be that way? Because it's just about the best way to feel that a human being has.
Exactly.
That's why, you know, there's nothing, the person's not telling themselves in the moment, something's wrong here. The exact opposite is happening, you know, which is why they'll fight you so hard when you try to present a cult member in that state with facts and reason and go, hey, buddy, you know, check this out. They're not even in the same universe as you in that moment, you know?
Yeah. And that, you know, again, this raises so many important ideas. I haven't read it, but I've been told that Immanuel Kant said there is the world around us, but we each of us live in our own representation of that world.
And that is a true statement. Yes, absolutely.
And of course, Scientologists agree with this. You have your own universe, though I think they should look up the word universe and they'll find it's not in fact correct. It's not a whole system of created things, but let's not worry about that.
No,
So,
it's a weird idea. Scientologists take that too, you
but
know.
it is relevant that we, you know, and again, it's Korzybski who tremendously influenced early Hubbard. We're told that he actually wasn't able to read Science and Sanity, and Science of Survival is riffing in the title of that. And so it was explained to him by A. Van Vogt, the brilliant science fiction writer who gave up writing for the rest of his life to practice Dianetics. I was in touch with him in the 1980s. And as a kid, he was just such a great storyteller. And he stopped doing that. So that's Hubbard's fault. That's a bad thing. But he'd studied, the world of Null. His novel is about general semantics and Korzybski. And Sarah, the bigamous second wife, I had no second wife, according to Aaron Hubbard, just a first and a third. She too had studied general semantics. And so you get this idea, the map is not the territory, but we live in the map. So my perception and my interpretation are all highly conditioned. Look at language, what a word may stimulate in one person and another. A friend came to visit me many, many years ago when I was still in Scientology, and I think I was playing Joni Mitchell's Court and Spark, and he said, "Oh, could you take that off?" I said, "Why? It's beautiful." He said, "No, I had a bad acid trip and there was a Joni Mitchell album on." And you're going, associative thinking. Each one of us has this set of reactions that belong to us because it might remind the little fish that it was swimming in brown water when the bad thing happened. We might think of it in those terms. But the reality is that we each have an incredible wealth of experience and interpretation, much of which is wrong. And that will lead us into serious difficulties. That when we first met Yuval Laor, which was in Toronto when you and I first met in June 2015, he had already developed this, and he started by encountering Scientology as a young man and going, wow, how can people be this crazy? This is fascinating. He's quite a rational sort of person.
Yeah.
And he then attended a lecture by Eva Jablonka, one of the great evolutionary thinkers of our time, who was one of the group of people who overthrew Dawkins' selfish gene idea back in the 90s. So no young biologist believes that it's, we're just perpetuating our genes. That's what's going on. What they worked out was that you can write on genes, you can change them. You've got epigenetics, but you've also got cultural transmission. And so what Yuval had done was to bring together his obsession with Scientology and other cults and why do people behave this way? How are they so easily taken in with the new evolutionary ideas about love, attachment, how the family works. And I heard these ideas with, significant appreciation. And I'm, in fact, editing his manuscript of his book at the moment. And we spent the last nearly 8 years talking about these wonderful ideas. But very soon on, I said to him, look, you've got parent-child, child-parent, teenager-parent, quite an interesting separation, baby-parent, sibling-sibling. You've got all of these familial relationships. And then you've got the notion of domestication, that human beings are, like cats and dogs, domesticated, trained animals. We're not, wild animals anymore. We've got all sorts of conventions we have to live to. But I said, where is infatuation in this model? And he eagerly went off and studied it. It's called limerence by psychologists, and added it into his model. We are talking about the need to be infatuated. I want to get high, I want to fall in love. I've just ordered this thing on Amazon and that felt so great when I was ordering it. Now it's arrived. I'm a bit bored. So I'll order something else. We are slaves to novelty, slaves to experience, the thrill seeking, which, as we've talked about this before, this won't lead to enlightenment or satisfaction. But it's fine getting some pleasure. Being a Puritan is no fun whatsoever. The idea you can have a miserable existence on earth so you can go and live in a miserable heaven, it just doesn't appeal to me at all. So we should have pleasure in our life. A couple of slice, a couple of squares of good dark chocolate every day, it's fine. It's good for you, more than two is not necessarily good. But there are things that we should take pleasure in. I'm absolutely all for that. I am an Epicurean Stoic. I am the Jiangsu side of Stoicism, where you're saying, "Oh no, shit! It's not Eeyore, shit happens, and you've got Marvin the paranoid android, and you've somehow got to deal with it." Marcus Aurelius of the Stoic philosophers. It's a glorious, wonderful world full of marvelous things for me to experience. So thrill seeking is fine. However, if you want to be happy, it's not going to do it. Earning a huge amount of money is not going to make you happy. It's not going to have any, once you're economically safe, it's not going to make any difference at all, other than you being able to say, I've got a new car, which is not really much of a satisfaction in terms of self-esteem or what have you.
Yeah.
In fact, happiness comes, it would seem to me, from two things. One is the life of the mind, that whatever is happening to you physically, you're engaged. And the greatest exponent of that was Stephen Hawking. His documentary about himself is one of the most brilliant things, because you're going, so he can twitch this muscle here and his penis still works, apparently, because blood flow is not interrupted. So his nurse ran off with him. But he sat there and he can twitch this muscle and communicate. And you get that he's a really happy man, despite the horrific thing that he suffered, being told he got 2 years max to live when he was a student.
Oh, yeah.
And his achievement, the first theoretical construction of the Big Bang, how the Big Bang occurred, as a student. What happens if two black holes meet? Nobody had asked that question before. Hawking radiation. Just this incredible mind. And he has the life of the mind. He actually was satisfied with, he'd be thinking out equations while all the other people at the party were going, "Oh, look, it's Stephen Hawking. He's been on The Simpsons," But so one part of it is the life of the mind. The other part of it is the feeling that you're doing some good in the world, that, that people are being helped by what you do. Those things lead to a permanent satisfaction. Scientology doesn't do that. Scientology is about making money. So let's jump into this hypnosis thing. I prefer to call it guided imagination, which is a definition in the Oxford Handbook of Hypnosis. And that really opens things up. When you're reading a book, when you're watching a movie, when you become taken up with the events, you're in your imagination. And creative people have to have tremendous imagination. This may be why it's difficult to impossible, in fact, it's said, to hypnotize phlegmatics, people who don't have emotional reactions, because there is no imagination there. There's nothing to
I
play
can
with.
see. Yeah, I see how that works. I would let me throw this out there just as initial thought on this, right? Because you say, okay, well, we don't have, you don't like the word trance or altered state. And I think, and I've used those terms, and the reason I've used them is to describe that we're not talking about a condition which most people think of as their normal state.
But their normal states are so many.
I know. I know. I'm not trying to accurately reflect reality right now. I'm talking about perception.
Thank God for that.
How people perceive themselves, right? Yeah. You're absolutely right. We're in all sorts of states, and there's all kinds of metrics that could be used to measure those states, from emotion to reasoning power to awareness, all these kind of things. And, and there are arguments to be made about all of these. How aware are you when, we see memes of a gorilla walking across the tennis court, but you don't notice it because there's a cute woman there? And it's kind of like, well, you're not very aware, are you? No, I'm hyper aware of this one thing, and therefore maybe not so aware of this other thing. Does that mean I'm somehow unaware? Not exactly. It's all a matter of kind of how we frame it and think about it.
Selective perception, it's called. And in the last couple of years, there have been counter arguments which support what you're saying. 80% of people, when they're told to count how many times the ball crosses the net in a ping pong game, don't see the two guys in gorilla suits that come on in place.
That's right. Right.
But
So I
that's
guess where
not necessarily a bad thing. That's,
that's the point. Is it's a matter of let's take the good and the bad off of this and instead go, well, what are we really doing? We're manipulating people's perceptions. We're manipulating somebody's thought process or value system. What's good, what's bad? Well, I'm going to sit you down and we're going to do a little mumbo jumbo here. And at the end of this, you're going to think a little differently than you do now. Right. And maybe you're not going to necessarily be aware of or consciously thinking about all the things I'm doing to you because I'm going to guide you through this process. And here we have this guided imagination concept. And so it's a matter maybe of kind of understanding the nuances of, well, what are we talking, perception and awareness and consciousness. These are really loosey-goosey words in a lot of ways, depending on how you're approaching these things, right? So I think it's a little important to narrow these things down a little bit. When I use the word trance or altered state, I'm referring to a place where you have been manipulated or brought into a state where somebody else's ideas or your own imagination can start having the same degree of reality and realism or agreement or acceptance to you that your own conscious thoughts and feelings have on you. And and again, we could sit here all day making arguments, and I know people will sometimes in the comments make arguments about, oh, well, you're not even really in charge of all of your own thoughts and feelings. Yeah, I know, but I'm trying to explain this in ways that people can kind of easily understand of, well, there's the things there's the things you're seeing right now. And then there's ways of curving that to where you think that's what's happening, but in fact, it's somebody else kind of throwing you some stuff instead. And you accept it, you buy into it, you go, yep, this is reality. And so this is where I might suggest past life memories could be installed, or the idea of ethics is reason, ethics is survival, these crazy kind of very fundamental ideas that Hubbard introduces to people through both the process of auditing, through repetition, mantras, overwhelming their perception, or through training, where the person just sort of accepts this information because it's an authority figure telling them, so they receive it uncritically. Both of those are, I think, different ways of talking about or looking at what we're talking about when we start throwing this word hypnotism around. I don't know. What do you think about everything I just said there?
No, I think it's very useful.
Okay.
The point is, however, that the outside agency directing your thoughts is not necessarily in the present moment. And
good point. Yeah.
The problem is that we, by the time we realize, we're already in the river swimming when we wake up somewhere between the age of 5 and 12 to being in the river. And our perception of the world is very limited. We have, perception is the receipt of wavelengths through the senses.
That's right.
And we can't see infrared, we can't see ultraviolet. So we have, an eagle has seriously better eyesight than we do. Our hearing is appalling compared to a cat, a dog, or a whale. Indeed, they can hear 100 times more than we can. So, those wavelengths that are between sound and color, we're missing. Those that are beyond color, we're missing. So we have poor perceptual skills in those terms. Our body there are parts of the body that are majorly interpretive of sensation. So the fingertips, the lips, the tongue, as represented in the diagram of the brain, showing how much of the brain is associated with the eyes, with the fingers. You get this strange little creature. with huge fingers. We have limited perception. Those perceptions are that's already limiting what we'll be able to see. The next part is interpretation, and the problem is that our interpretation never can become objective. It can't.
Right. That's right.
Because there are limitations upon, and that interpretation will be conditioned by what we've been taught, outside influence, what we've experienced. I mean, it bothered me before Scientology. So as a 17-year-old, that there seemed to be this, there was nature and nurture. And these were the two things that were going on. And I'm going, well, can't I influence this by understanding anything? Isn't there a third part to this, that I wasn't just conditioned into this, or it's just genetic? Am I not? And the contemporary view of evolution actually now finally allows a self to be part of that. But the self, oh dear, we have come in psychology to the point where Buddhism rules. There is no self. You know, I think James Watson of Crick and Watson fame, the DNA stuff, was the last person to seriously suggest that there was a control center in the brain. So there was he thought it was the chiasmatic nucleus. It isn't. And what is happening is that the 200 brain regions are interacting in real time so that I can say words without having to think about what I'm going to say. And that's a scary thought. So very much of the process inside us is automatic, and it can be hijacked. We don't have an unconscious mind. I think that's nonsense. But we do have unconscious processes, and we can. When I was involved in Zen Buddhism for a year before Scientology, and learned to meditate in a monastery and all that great stuff. And meditation was very useful for me. But I think the context of meditation becomes really important. It can be very dangerous if you don't get what's going on. But it was useful to me in that I sat there in the Zen monastery, and I only lasted 3 days. I'd meant to go for 6 months, and I'm really glad at the end of 3 days I left, because I absolutely consider Zen Buddhism to be an authoritarian cult. Clever and amusing, though, and insightful many of the things are. The idea of the Zen stick, where you're thwacked over the shoulders if you move at all while meditating, doesn't seem to me a humanely acceptable technique, let alone their training of the whole of the Japanese military, which took away any, they were the worst people to come up against, because they had complete contempt for anybody who was not Japanese.
That's right.
They murdered perhaps 400,000 people at Nanjing. That's more than Hiroshima and Dresden combined, civilians. And the general that did it was commended by his Zen master. So, we have to be a bit careful about these things. But for me, one of the revelations of meditation was that I could see there were processes going on in my mind that were normally below my consciousness, but they were not unconscious. And I got to seeing 4 levels of thinking that were active at the same time, just for a moment while in the monastery. And that opened the world up to me and made my perception of who I am and what I am different. I know that we're thinking in language, so we're encoding everything into language, which is a very inexact thing. And then we think in that very inexact thing. That's why it's really important to rebrand, to take the words that we're used to using, like trance, altered state, hypnosis, and say, let's push those aside and look at what we're describing and see if there's a way that we can better understand it by using, a different language, because the language itself starts to determine what we're able to think, as George Orwell pointed out in 1984.
Sure.
So that idea that there's an external source directing me through suggestibility, yeah, that's interesting, but it's happening internally as well.
Yeah.
So, so the state that we call hypnosis is of itself deeply controversial. I have sought to teach people in the last 40 years, as I have found out about these things, to think about what's happening, so that rather than hypnotizing them and getting them to change something, they can understand that we're all in a hypnotic state all the time. Yes, you have this separate thing of putting somebody into a trance, but the reality is that the processing that occurs in the mind is 24/7, and we are So, for example, take priming. Darren Brown is the go-to guy to understand this stuff in real time because of what he's been able to do and demonstrate.
That's
So
right.
he did one of his early shows about 20 years ago. He took two guys and he had them. He said, "I want you to design a poster for a pet cemetery." And when they were done with it, he showed them that he'd already drawn all of the stuff. And then he showed you the route that he'd had them travel and the images they'd been exposed to during that route. Now, I think some of the things they came to, you'd come to anyway, the gates of heaven and stuff like that. But they'd visually been primed to think these things. We don't necessarily realize.
And let's be clear for the audience. What we're literally talking about is putting photos or drawings or pictures in their environment without them being aware of it. Stuff in the hallway outside their office, stuff that they would see on a billboard, something they would see on a sign walking in the building. Words and concepts and colors and ideas that he was creating in their environment on purpose without them knowing about it, that we're going to influence their thinking. And then he presents a scenario and they go right to where he wanted them to go because of that priming. That's what we're talking about.
Exactly. I mean, the most devastating demonstration, and it's about 10 minutes, is him with the actor Simon Pegg. And he has had Pegg write down what he wants as a gift on a little bit of paper and put it in a sealed envelope sometime before the show. And they then have the show, and he said, "Well, I'm going to work out what it is you want by having this conversation with you." And at the end of the conversation, he says, so what was it that you wrote down that you wanted? And he said, a red BMX bike. And there in the studio, in a box, is a red BMX bike. He then says, "Open the envelope." And he pulls the envelope out. And he said, "What does it say?" He says, "It says a leather jacket." And he then, and this is very rare, he shows you the priming that he's gone through. And it's quite startlingly exact. They've got all of these wheels, all of these circles in the environment. The color red is there. Yes. And when you listen again to the spiel that he gives, you realize that he's used all sorts of words that are associated with bicycles.
Yes.
And half words.
Exactly. That's right.
This is priming, and this is a process that doesn't happen. You don't need Darren Brown. Just looking around the room, whatever catches your eye is priming you, because it's putting your mind towards that within the unconscious processes. So, if Tony Robbins or somebody like this, these seminars use incredible amounts of priming to bring people into a certain state of mind where they can be directed. Let's put aside manipulated. Let's put aside suggestibility. We can direct other people. Yes. And it's so much simpler than people imagine. If you want to affect somebody emotionally, there are certain words you can use that will change their emotional state. For most people. Funeral, death, sex. There are things that take the mind to a certain place. And if you can keep that going for long enough, you can put somebody into a place where you can change their mind. Now, the fundamental practices, and I should have patented this is my thought, but I've not seen anybody say this so simply, are repetition, fixation, and mimicry. So fixation, let's start with training routine 0 and staring at things, the Ganzfeld effect. If you sit somebody, and Darren Brown's done this too, in a completely dark room, within a few minutes, they will think there's something moving. They will hear something. And what's happened, as happens in meditation, mindfulness, TR0, call it what you will, when you stare fixedly at something, there's not enough information coming in from the environment anymore. And so your mind, and I'm using the word mind rather than brain here, boys and girls, your mind will start to turn up the amplification, the sensitivity, and you'll start seeing things. You'll hallucinate. Now, interestingly enough, if we get into the fundamentals of hypnosis, positive and negative hallucination, seeing something that isn't there, not seeing something that is there, is considered to be an altered state, is considered to be a trance state. I'm just going to say it's a state of mind. And it's a state of mind that can be easily induced. Just get somebody to stare at something, sit them in a dark room, and the sensitivity turns up, and you get the feedback from the system itself, because it can't, we can't find anything there. So that's fixation, repetition. And in Scientology, there's a very interesting one. I mean, he uses what he calls Chinese school, where you just chant things. And
That's right.
of course, staff members,
preferably very loudly, by the way.
Yeah.
Really add some force and emphasis to it,
Staff members get this particularly, in daily musters where you're expected to. Now, this we see in dancing, say the Sufi dancers in Istanbul, that dancing round and round and spinning. We see it in,
sure. Yeah. The whirling dervishes.
The whirling dervishes. So a process originally from Mavlavi, the great Rumi, one of the most brilliant men who ever lived, as far as I'm concerned, the poet Rumi. But it was against Muslim practice where he was, indeed, for the most part in Persia, though he was from Turkey, what is now Turkey. It was the practice that dancing was wrong. And it's been put forward by one commentator, Idris Shah, that he introduced this practice because it made people have to think differently by doing something that violated a rule. But he also knew that by repeating the movement, they would get dizzy. Now, the thing they have on their head when they're dancing, they have a rectangular thing on their heads. That's meant to be their tombstone. That's what they're meditating upon. And they will, by spinning round, they'll induce a state of mind, an altered state of mind. And they will have these astonishing revelations and feelings. They'll have cognitions and very good indicators. If you look at Moroccan drumming, where, and you get the ululation, the going on, you can see people falling into hypnotic states, whatever we want to call them, trance states, what have you. So that one is...
Is that so different from what we see in Pentecostal religious services, snake dancing and the speaking in the tongues, and people literally throwing their bodies around in rapturous, feelings of the spirit and this kind of thing? I think that's a very similar activity where I
think we're into the same thing, that we're dealing with a repetition of movement, of sound. I listen to an enormous amount of music, everything from sort of medieval music right into things that are actually being recorded now, this very minute, because I have a guitar player in the house who's doing that. And I grew up listening to blues rock, things like Cream and Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, John Mayall, stuff like that. And there's those people, Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, they heard blues. But when they saw live blues, it's not the same as the little 2.5-minute recordings. If you find, say, a James Brown gig, they'll get to this thing where they're just repeating the same phrase over and over again. Sly and the Family Stone, absolutely brilliant. And it induces a state, by repeating the same phrase. And it's fun, it's fine, until and unless, as William Sargent, the psychiatrist who is considered the #1 suppressive person in Britain, as he pointed out, I think in his book, The Mind Manipulators, he went on a tour of the world to look at these states that were being induced by certain things. And he talked to a male nurse who said, if you want to get laid, go to a revival meeting, because the women get so high that you can just take them out. So there's a piece of advice that I don't want anybody to be following, by the way.
Yes, please don't do that. Yeah, wow.
But
taking advantage of somebody. Yeah.
That's the repetition aspect
Yeah.
of, so we go into a state because, and you can do it. I think it was, I remember it was Wordsworth or Tennyson who said, if you just repeat your name over and over again, you'll go into a state. Well, of course, this is transcendental meditation. You are given the name of a demon or deity, which is a secret, and you repeat it over and over. When Herbert
Right.
Benson investigated them in the 60s and said to them, well, tell me what your mantras are. And they're not really mantras, they're just single words. Tell me what they are. And they said, oh, no, that's sacred and holy, although we're not a religious practice in any way because we want to get in the US Army and the schools. And so he said, all right, I'll get people to use the word one. And he found that he got exactly the same responses. And it was the repetition of the word. Now, the point is that you are inducing a state, and it may well be a bliss state, a euphoric state. You may have very good indicators. And I am not saying that's a bad thing, as long as you know why it's happening. If you think it's because your guru has supernatural powers, then you're wrong.
Exactly. And it's the
neurological response.
interpretation. This is where, this is key here, right? Is because what we're talking about here is ways of induction, or, that dirty word manipulation, right? Or changing states. But it's not it. I'm really glad you just mentioned that, because that's not the dangerous part. The dangerous part is how we interpret that event.
Yes.
That's the hard part, right? That's the part that people can't get their wits around, is it's not the state. There's nothing wrong with being happy or being high or having a really great experience. People do it with drugs, alcohol, sex, comic books. I mean, anything that's going to get you going. Movies,
dancing, drumming, music, movies.
Exactly. Our whole lives are built around activities that induce these states in us. The problem isn't the state, it's what we think caused the state, what induces the state, what lets the state continue, and chasing after it with the misguided notion that it is my glimpse of heaven, my, whatever the guru has told you. Oh, it's my exteriorization. I'm out of my body.
I'm out of my head.
Yeah, I'm having this spiritual moment, right? And that's the danger, is the interpretation of the event, because I wanted to point this one out just as along the line of what you were talking about earlier of, how many of us go have an idea, go into pick up our phone or go onto a social media thing. I'm going to go send this tweet. I'm going to go make this post on Facebook. And you go there, and 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes later, you're like, I never made that post because I got so distracted by this post, this color, this advertisement, this piece of thing. What is that? Is it any different from what we're talking about? You go in with one state of mind, and within a millisecond, you find yourself uncontrollably unaware of the fact you've entered into another state, and it takes you 20 minutes to realize, wait a minute, I came here to do this, right? Is it any different from what we're talking about? Not really.
Yeah, it's part of, and I think that's the problem of these discrete kind of altered states, suggestibility, that it is as if there's something special. I'm currently reading a book by Gloria Mark called Attention Span, which is brilliant on this subject. She spent decades studying human attention, and not just putting people on computers and having them do little games, which many psychologists do, but doing it, as she says, in the wild. So she'll put heart monitors and things that are inconspicuous and see over a fair period of time. And she's been very interested in interruption of attention and the rabbit holes of the internet, and has some very cogent advice about, getting back your life from the internet and all of that. I would also say that, as with, when I left Scientology, you could talk to people. In Scientology, you can't really ask people much about their experience, because that they're meant to talk about their case only to their auditor, and they're not meant to have verbal tech and so on and so forth. So I had a standard question probably for the first year after I left, and I talked with hundreds of former members during that time. And the question was, what was it that convinced you? What was the peak experience you had, or the moment of awe, as Yuval would put it? What was the peak experience you had that convinced you that this was worth doing? And it was very interesting because almost all of the people I talked with said it was training routine 0.
Right. There it is.
Some of them said a book 1 Dianetics session, which Hubbard himself called hypnotic when he cancelled it in 1951, you know, because fluttering of the eyelids, all of that stuff.
That's right.
But then I sort of made a little guess about this quite early on and said, and you wanted to achieve that state again? And they say, yes. And you never did. Yes. Now, this is exactly parallel to drug experiences with hard drugs, addictive drugs, that you build tolerance up. It requires more and more to get the same effect. And talking to junkies, and contrary to what Scientology tells people, I've never taken heroin, let alone having been a junkie. I've never, been a junkie of any kind. Other than perhaps studying Scientology. I shouldn't be doing this anymore. Why am I doing this? But I got the idea, well, yes, this is exactly that. You're having to up the dose and it's no longer satisfying. So it's always the idea. And I got this when I was doing the Class 0 course at St. Hill, that I realized that everybody wanted to sign things off on the check sheet as fast as possible so they could get to the next course. And I realized it especially over the hypnosis and the tone scale, the observation of the obvious. Hypnosis. Yes. Thank you for that new word, Ron. And I realized that that was in contradiction to Scientology 8008 in terms of where people are. Everybody's below death, this kind of thing. That there's direct contradiction. And the other 3 students that were working on the same level, my twin and another pair, they just, when I brought it up to them, they'd signed that off already. I got sent to qualifications division, because I'm saying this is a contradiction, a double bind indeed. And thankfully back then, they didn't charge you any money. So I just went through the annoyance of them not understanding what I was talking about and went back to the course. But I realized that, it's like the Amazon parcel. I'm finally on this course I so wanted to do. I want to be on the next one. Exactly. That's a junkie. You're going, I want the next hit, the next hit, the next hit.
That's right. That's right. It's chasing that high, as we call it. Yeah. And that is absolutely, people can become addicted to. I watched it happen. Even when I was in, I found it a little disturbing. When the one example that was so obvious, even as a Scientologist, I couldn't deny it, was a woman who, every time her needle stopped floating, she was in the organization demanding to get back in session immediately, practically in tears, because she needed that session.
Fix.
And we were, I was like, holy crap, lady. Like, it was a little scary. I had seen people who were really, into it to get their auditing, but this woman was actually scary, and unfortunately, that wasn't the only time I've observed that over the years, and it's this exact phenomena. How could you explain that behavior? I mean, it's absolutely the simplest explanation for what we're talking about. This just checks off all of these boxes.
I mean, in Robert Cialdini's Influence, a book that anybody and everybody ought to read, he talks about going to a lecture on transcendental meditation with 2 presenters, and he took along a professor of logic, and they presented, and then the professor of logic stood up and said, this, and this. And the first presenter tried to answer and went, oh no, handed over to the second one, who went, oh yeah, you got a point. And they got completely locked. And then people signed up to do the course. So Cialdini and this other guy, as they left, said, why did you sign up? You heard that they don't know what they're talking about. And the response was, if I'd thought about what you'd said, I wouldn't have signed up. But I'm desperate for some kind of change in my life. And so people are hooked in that way. The third thing I came to, in trying to simplify this whole mess is mimicry. So we have repetition, fixation, and mimicry. And if you ape somebody else, that's the word that's used in English, it's a good word for that, because apes don't do it, we do, then you will start to behave like them. And it's actually foundational to cognitive behavioral therapy, and one of the things that they don't necessarily understand about what they're doing. It's called patterning in other places. Now, in Scientology, you have, in the objective processes, the direct use of mimicry, where you are seeking to sync people. Now, hypnotists the technique they use is called pacing. And in therapeutic systems, it's often taught without explaining that it has what could be called the hypnotic basis. And of course, we don't do that in our therapies. In the Dead Poets Society, which is a wonderful movie, there's a scene where Robin Williams has the pupils walking around the courtyard, and he has them do it. And then he points out to them that they've fallen into step with each other. They're marching. That it's a natural process with human beings to mimic and that makes us more susceptible. It's presumably why armies the world over do the left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, and all of that stuff, that you are basically conditioning people into obedience, into response.
Yep. That's right. And look at how easy it is to do, because we're kind of built for it.
Yeah. And it is said that, I made a comment about apes. It's said about the other primates that human beings tend to absolutely mimic an action to learn it. Apes don't. The other apes don't. But they will do something like what the other bonobo, chimp, gorilla, or orangutan did, and they will learn how to do the thing. But we will do it precisely, and that means that we also tend to pass on mistakes. So the famous story, it's told many times, is the woman who cuts the end off a piece of ham, both ends off, before she cooks it. And one of her friends says, "Why are you doing that?" He said, "Oh, well, my mum does it." So she calls her mum up and she says, "Why do we cut the ends off the ham?" And she says, "You know what? Your grandma does it." So she calls the grandma up and says, "Why did you cut the ends off the ham?" She said, "Well, my baking tray was too small." There's one, Primo Levi, the brilliant Primo Levi. He talks about, he was an industrial chemist, and he arrives at a factory where they're putting this additive into the paint. And he's saying, "Why are you putting that in?" And I go, "I don't know, we've been doing it for years." And then he remembered that years before he'd visited this factory and they'd had a batch of paint that had gelled and it needed to be turned to a liquid. And so he said, "Add this chemical." So they were doing what he'd told them, and they'd completely lost. And I would say that a lot of religions and a lot of political practices, all sorts of groups with human beings, got no idea why they've got a chasuble and a thurible, and whether Jesus would have recognized these words at all, and why. But they're, in fact, repeating the rituals. They're doing it the same way every time. They're doing it exactly. I mean, for the Romans, this was so exact that the 3 days of invocations prior to a major festival, if a priest made a mistake, if there was one word wrong, they had to go back to the beginning and do it all again. Claudius, being a stutterer, decided to abolish that rule, but for some time before him. So the ritual has to be exact, has to be. Now, let's move into Scientology and think about that. Auditing commands. They're not questions, they're commands. And they have to be worded exactly the same way. They do. So the person doing the auditing is actually inducing a state through repetition in their own work. The worst I've ever seen was the man who was held to be the top auditor in the UK, Richard Rees, who had a master's degree from Oxford. He's the man that, when Bill Clinton said, "I went to Oxford with a Scientologist, it can't be that bad because he was okay." What a heck of a way to reason something, I had dinner with a Nazi once and he was really courteous. So Nazi, not really. Richard Rees was, I'd complained. I was on OT5 in 1981, I think it was, 82. And I'd complained that the guy who was auditing me, Mike Austin, couldn't open the window in his room. So the room was, he was OT5, but he couldn't open the window. And his room smelled and it was overheated. And I was sort of, why am I? And rather than showing Mike how to open his window, which actually opened onto the concourse so that anybody outside that window could have heard an OT5 session, rather than doing that, they assigned me to Richard Rees, who was the Tech Sec UK, the Technical Secretary UK. He was the head of all auditing in the United Kingdom, all Scientology counselling. And this was significant enough that in the morning he had Van Morrison, and in the afternoon he had me. And we were the only two people he was doing. And he really freaked me out because he was completely wooden. There was just no reaction, no emotional connection of any kind, which I think was a consequence of the rehabilitation project force and him having the spirit sucked out of his body.
Yeah.
Poor man. But seeing this, that you become this robot, that the perfect auditor has all of his or her attention on you, all of it, while looking at the e-meter, the command sheet, and writing down what you say. Well, it's not going to be all of it, I'm reckoning. And that double bind, that lie, then Hubbard was so good at these, the only reason a student gives up a study or becomes confused is the misunderstood word. It says at the beginning of all Scientology books. However, there's also too steep a gradient. There's also absence of mass. There's also suppressive rendition, which I'd say is what Scientology is. But the only reason you give up, well, except for these other reasons, he so frequently, sticks you with one of those sort of things. Right. The other and final part well, no, not the final part, really. If you want to induce a state where you can control somebody, direct them, then the royal road is confusion.
I'm so glad you brought this up because I was going to bring this up if you didn't. So yes, please go into this. So
Milton Erickson, who was about the only serious practitioner of hypnosis by the 1950s, it had been dismissed as a silly,
party trick or something.
Yeah, exactly. It was, I think it said that by the mid-1970s, only 2 of the 90 psychology degrees available in the US even mentioned hypnosis. Well, so Erickson just kept on doing what he was doing. He was giving a lecture one day, and there was a professor in the front row who stood up to start railing against what he was saying. And Erickson said, "Why don't you come up to the podium?" And the guy came up, and Erickson put his hand out, and the guy put his hand out, but Erickson kept on moving down and tied the guy's shoelace. He didn't shake hands with him. There's the confusion moment. And in that moment, he said, "You could just go back to your seat and sit quietly till the end of the talk." And the professor turned round, went and sat in his seat. When somebody is confused, they become vulnerable to direction from the outside. Let's link that back to cognitive dissonance. We reject anything that goes against our beliefs because that will mean we are confused. And when we are confused, we are more easily directed. The problem is with people who are in cognitive dissonance, and we all are to some degree, that believing things that are nonsense, and acting in ways that are irrational and unhelpful, that we're in a state of confusion. And any extreme of emotion, whether it's elation, terror, or rage, makes us more susceptible to direction. So William Sargent in Battle for the Mind says, he's writing in the 50s when it's a bit dangerous to go after Christianity. But he says, so I'm going to talk about the sect I grew up in. I'm a Methodist. And he gives an account from the life of John Wesley, the founder of the Methodists in the 18th century. And he says at his talks, people would quite standardly, he would say, this is what heaven's like. This is what hell's like. Flesh dripping off, horrible. And when you're walking home tonight, you could be struck. And if you don't accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior right now, you're going to the nasty place. And people would spin round in the audience and fall to the ground. And the mimicry aspect of this is that usually a particular hypnotic operator, to use L. Ron Hubbard's term, will induce an exact response. Faith healers, again, do this, that people, and for Wesley, it would be this spinning around and falling down. There was a guy who's at the back of the hall and he starts shouting at Wesley and saying, this is absolute nonsense, what you're saying. He takes 5 steps, spins around, falls to the ground, and stands up converted. Any extreme of emotion makes you more vulnerable to external direction. And so, enraging somebody, a really clever manipulator can actually get you absolutely furious and then put in the control they want, which in Ron Hubbard's case would be, give me all your money. The governing policy of Scientology, make money, make more money, and all of that nonsense.
Right.
So
one wonders, what comes to mind for me right now is commenting on Larry Ray.
Yes.
Right? From that Hulu Stolen Youth documentary, right? The man who basically enslaved about 5 college students for a period of around 10 years.
And so he moves in with his daughter who's at college,
yep.
and he then takes over these students who are eminently clever people, some of them, and he manages to completely control them. I've not seen the documentary, but I've heard about it from you and from Steve Hassan.
Yeah, it's impressive, and it's impressive to watch the video footage of how he was going about doing that, because what you hear in him is a calm, sort of not calm like why don't you, but very much not responding to the horror story that is in front of him, whether it's somebody having a psychotic episode or somebody, who is being castigated and physically abused by Larry Ray as he's talking to them, antagonizing them, pushing them, saying things to them. But a comment that I made in response to Larry Ray and watching that is the superpower, I called it, that these manipulators or predators seem to have in those moments where somebody can come at them. And this has been noted by people. Jim Jones could do this. L. Ron Hubbard could do this, where somebody could come at them even pissed, even upset with them. I'm upset because you have blah, blah, and they're going to go confront them on it, or they're going to go into their presence and they're going to talk to them about something. And either way, they end up walking out, not only just absolutely positive that this person, not only this Larry Ray character, this L. Ron Hubbard character, not only wasn't wrong, but they walk out of that room wondering what's wrong with themselves that they ever even thought to question the motives and intentions and goodness of this predator. And I called it a superpower, being able to turn that on a person. And it suggests a little bit of what you were just talking about there, where somebody comes in a confusion. They are upset. They are angry about their cognitive dissonance. They are trying to resolve. Here's this person, this authority figure again, right? Who they have invested their emotional life in. And now this person seems to be betraying those values, seems to be a hypocrite, because they are. And they're going to go, resolve this cognitive dissonance. They're going to go resolve this problem they have with this guy. And instead, it somehow gets turned on them. And now they're questioning themselves, right? And I can't help but think of what we were just talking about there, with taking that confusion, taking that issue, and using it as an opportunity to install some more nonsense in the person, Yeah,
and it became so extreme that the trauma bonding, as some people call it, that was occurring in 1968 aboard Hubbard's ships, where
that's for sure.
I've interviewed lots of people about overboarding, and I published the photographs that Hubbard took in order to Auditor number 41. I put them on the internet in the mid-90s. That's where it came from. Quite a lot of my library was shared. I mean, the Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard, the documentary that came, I got it out of Granada TV's archives. But to see, which is filmed in that period, and everybody should watch that to see the wretched state that the Sea Organization were in. You know, they look so distressed, and Hubbard blinking his way through, you know, lying his way. You know, I had no second wife. There are no Swiss bank. There is one Swiss bank account, you know, and him being asked about his belief in reincarnation, and he hesitates, and so Charlie Nairn says, "But your followers believe," and Hubbard goes, "Oh yes." All right, fine, good. So, you know, Karen de la Carrière, and I say I'd interviewed lots of people who'd had this happen to them. She pointed out that in the harbour at Corfu, where they were throwing them over, there were other ships docked, and all of the ships were discharging their sewage into the water. So these people were being thrown from 25 to 40 feet high. The high diving board at our swimming pools is 14 feet. Some of them couldn't swim. They were being blindfolded. They're having their ankles tied together. And you go, just the direct trauma bonding that's happening here, that you've got to come away from this, again, following Cialdini's consistency or commitment principle, or the sunk cost fallacy. I've had this horrible thing done to me. What's the benefit I've got? You know, so it was good for me in this way to be thrown into human excrement by this monster who is saving humanity, because he cares about trauma. He doesn't want to cause engrams by throwing people into sewage. There may be another of those double binds going on there. And then just to get into what the states are that are associated with this thing that's called hypnosis. I mentioned positive and negative hallucination, and you talked about the gorilla suit experiment. So selective perception means this isn't just a hypnotic effect. This is something that we're all selecting from the environment, that which is significant to us. And that means that there'll be negative hallucination. There'll be things we don't notice.
Yes.
Then there's positive hallucination. As you also said, the function of the mind is to predict. So this whole meditation to be in the present moment, no, you need to be alert to what's happening so you can predict what will happen, so that the lion doesn't eat you or whatever. You know, we have these things. In terms of positive hallucination, if you're driving along at night and you see a pile of leaves by the side of the road, you can instantly read that as a person. I mean, I had it happen where there was a black waste bag in the road, and it looked as if there was somebody lying down in the road.
Sure.
Because, and again, if you see an abstract pattern and there are two dots in it, you will interpret them as eyes. And as a painter, I'm very familiar with Gestalt and how people read things, because I make abstract paintings that are complicated, and people start seeing highly realistic things in them. But what they're seeing is only in their own mind. It's not something I put there. And that I devised this method while I was a Scientologist, and probably wasn't meant to be studying Gestalt psychology, but, you know, a bit of a maverick, just as L. Ron Hubbard said he was. So we will interpret the world with positive hallucination. We'll see stuff that isn't there in our attempt to work out what is. But getting people to see things or not see things is part of it. You then have age regression and age progression. So in Scientology, it's age regression. You know, you are finding things in the past that, you know, are memories. And you get this interesting mixture that some of what you remember will be real. It used to bother me because I have a reasonably good memory. And I'd be auditing somebody, and I'd realize that if I asked them what they had for breakfast, they probably couldn't tell me. But they'd be saying, oh yeah, I was 6 years old and this, that, and the other. So that leads us into the past lives stuff, which is age regression. It's making somebody. Now, The reality is that when you tell somebody to regress to age 7, they will mimic a 7-year-old talking in the way a 7-year-old would. They're not actually entering that time. There's mimicry going on. And mimicry is one of the most fascinating aspects of humanity. I got to this. I knew 2 women who read the book When Rabbit Howls, which allegedly describes a person who has 99 personalities, distinct personalities, multiple personality disorder, before we started calling it dissociative identity disorder. And there are skeptics in this room at this moment about that condition, because we are all capable of mimicking anything, any behavior another human being can do. I saw these 2 women. I knew them, one of them very well, before they read this book. And they read this book and they each developed multiple personalities. It was shameful to see. It was awful to see how. So because we can mimic states, we have to be very careful about how we diagnose somebody and what's really going on with them. And part of that is the induction of false memories through age regression. And, you know, again, Darren Brown, he had a guy who was going, oh, yeah, I was 5 and I went up in this hot air balloon. And it just taken him a few minutes to get the guy to believe this. And he'd already checked with the guy's family and what have you to make sure it had not happened. And so you have people who are talking about being in combat alongside L. Ron Hubbard, or, you know, the time they spent on the planet Zog or what have you. And you are into a completely hallucinated world, which a hypnotist would say, that's hypnotism. You then have age progression, which doesn't happen so much in Scientology, but you can get somebody to do the opposite. You can get them to go forward. Now, this is used as a therapeutic technique by some people. One of the ones is sit down and write a list of the things that you want to have achieved by the time you die. And that can be very beneficial to people to focus them on what really matters to them. That's age progression. Then you can have amnesia and hypomnesia. Hyperamnesia, hypomnesia. Amnesia, you can get people to forget things, and we do quite naturally. Or you can get people to remember things. And again, Hubbard will have seen this as a fundamental technique when he was studying hypnosis, which he said he started doing when he was 16. He says in Dianetics is not in any way based on hypnosis. He also says in Dianetics, same book, it's totally based on hypnosis. And he also, as I've famously repeated, in Science of Survival said, never believe a hypnotist. I'm underlining the word never. L. Ron Hubbard said, never believe a hypnotist, and he said he was a hypnotist. But he will have seen the hypomnesia practiced by hypnotists as therapy, where they're getting people to recover memories. What we now know is that most of these recovered memories will be false.
That's right. And often as a result of inadvertent or sometimes verdant suggestion. Right.
Advertent. And that leads us to the final aspect, which is heightened perception. And I remember is it the Book of E-meter Essentials or the Book of E-meter Drills? I think it's the Drills. And it has the list of pre-clear originations in it.
Yes, pre-clear origination sheet, yes.
I hadn't looked at that for a very, very long time. And then
the colors in the room are brighter somehow.
I wanted to you know, quote Moo Gum Guy Pan
some gum war
somebody in an email about 6 or 7 years ago. So I pulled out this list, not having looked at it since the early 1980s.
Yep.
And because I have now read so much about hypnosis, and let me explain, I've never practiced or trained as a hypnotist because I was horrified to think that that's what I'd been doing in Scientology. I wanted to know about it so I wouldn't do it. And so I could, I suppose, to some extent, see if it was being done to me, but more really because I didn't want to be manipulating people, because I'd been trained for 9 years to manipulate people. Reading that list, you know, you're getting bigger, you're getting smaller. The heightened perception So what he's saying is these are the things that people will say in auditing sessions, and you're going, they will tell you that they're experiencing hypnotic effects. They're experiencing things that are normally associated with hypnotic conditions. And that's what you can expect as an auditor. He doesn't really explain why or how. And having studied hypnosis his whole adult life, he knows very well what he's saying with those lists.
Exactly.
Whew.
Exactly. It's really quite something. Yeah, I was trying to see if I could pull it up here, because you have things like, I feel like I have a tight band around my head.
Mm.
They just like these really bizarre sensations.
I can't stop thinking about that cop who blew his whistle at me this morning.
That's right. That's right. I keep thinking that's right. Yeah, these really wild statements, and you're just like, where'd they get these things from? Well, these are things people say when they're, being hypnotized.
He also says that your misunderstood words will screw you up and get in the way of your learning, but he doesn't explain what mu gum gai pan means.
Exactly.
And you don't think to look it up, but
no,
it is a real thing.
Yes. Well, yeah, exactly. Okay. Let me say this. Let me see what your thinking is on this, and then we'll maybe wrap up here. It seems to me that a lot of what we've been talking about when we and sort of debunking maybe these concepts, or not debunking, but modifying, or we're going to be clarifying, the trance and altered states and these various things, right? What are we talking about?
Illuminating.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Illuminating. Shining some light on this. I hope that kind of what I'm getting here, and I hope what the audience has kind of been getting from what we've been talking about here, is that we're not off in the field of abnormal psychology right now.
No.
We're in the very normal psychology field here and talking about all of this. We've been normalizing a lot of things here. We're talking about things everyone experiences all the time. You watch TV, you go into a classroom, you go see a lecture, you go to a movie, you go watch a concert.
You talk with a friend.
Talk with a friend.
Just as we are doing now. Yeah.
Yeah. All these different places we go. Well, what are we doing? Well, we're receiving input. We're giving output, but we're receiving a lot of input. And what are we doing with that? What's it doing to us? Well, it does all kinds of things to us. Gets us thinking, gets us feeling, gets us emoting. But sometimes it can get us into a place where we're accepting information uncritically.
Yes.
And if that's not suggestion, I don't know what is. And there are lots and lots of things that can put you in that place. So could we say we're all running around in a hypnotic trance all the time? Probably a little strong language using, describing it that way. But are we always aware of what we're inputting and how we're thinking about it? No, we are not. And if anything is being made in an effort on my part, or I think on John's part, in discussing critical thinking, emotional intelligence, mindfulness or awareness or learning or understanding this stuff, we use these words. And I think what we're really talking about here is kind of being a little bit more aware of what you're inputting and what's affecting you, and what are you choosing to let affect you, and how are you interpreting these effects? Because it's going to happen. These things are going to happen to you. How do you interpret it? And do you interpret it against a set of standards that's maybe a little, objective, or a bunch of subjective ideas like, this is what Jesus wants from me, or what would Ron do, or,
the devil is suggesting I should listen to music, and music is evil. Yeah.
So it just seems that, this is maybe more of a broad, if you wanted to start putting this in language of, well, is this a problem? Well, yeah, it is, or it certainly can be made into one, but it might be one that all of us are experiencing from time to time, not just those wacky, stupid cult members. And I think that's kind of the point I wanted to make in drawing this to a close is this is an us problem. It's not just a cult problem.
It's the problem of our world. And I'm very emphatic about this, that authoritarianism, obedience to authority, unthinking, uncritical obedience to authority is what's got us into this mess. It's why there's a war in Ukraine. And wars in many other places as well, unfortunately. It's why the environment is being devastated, even though it's the 18th century when the first ecological writings are being made by von Humboldt, who is just an amazing character. He was Darwin's superhero. That was what Darwin was reading on the Beagle, von Humboldt. Von Humboldt pointed out there were priests in South America who, because they loved turtle eggs so much, were harvesting them all. And he said, this will mean that there won't be any more eggs after a while. And this is in like 1790 or something. So we're at this point now where we're poisoning and devastating the world. We are supporting the Chinese fascist dictatorship so that we can have lots of plastic stuff that we can feed to the dolphins and the fishes. And I mean, in this country, our rivers, particularly in England, actually, it's worse in England than in Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. The pollution levels in our rivers are absolutely appalling. We're pouring sewage into, we're doing awful things. We're doing these awful things unthinkingly, uncritically, because we have not yet grown up enough to be able to take responsibility for our actions and rein in the tyrants and manipulators and predators who are allowing this to happen. Because without laws, it's not going to change. And yeah, we're seeing something. But the thought that, Rachel Carson published her book in Silent Spring in 1963, and she was annihilated by the chemical industry and people and she was suggesting that DDT was bad for people and that there was going to be a problem. DDT is still being used in Africa. It's still being used, and it poisons generation after generation. Everything that touches it is contaminated. So we've got, as a species, we're doing awful things. When I was 17 or 18, a friend of mine said, the best thing that could happen for planet Earth is to wipe out all human beings. And it took me a couple of years with that one, kind of going, ooh, you might have a point. And eventually I went, no, it's been messed up so badly that the only species that can save the planet is us. So it's the other way around. I'm a big Greta Thunberg fan myself. I've even written poetry about her. Remarkable woman. But we need to understand the authoritarian relationship before anything else. And that means understanding how we are affected and growing up, just getting past it and doing something wonderful with our lives, which we might as well do rather than, Montaigne wrote this brilliant essay about death, and he wrote brilliant essays about everything pretty much, but it's 16th century contemporary of Shakespeare, even though he was French, and they are natural enemies, of course. But Montaigne wrote about death, and he said that he spent his youth worrying about death, and now as a man who was in his 50s and therefore approaching death in normal span of years at that time, he realized what an amount of time he'd wasted, that it wasn't a problem at all. It was absolutely fine. And so getting people to, and so much of what we call religion is worrying about death. As far as I'm concerned, that's not the good stuff in religion, and there's very good stuff in the major religions, in all of them. But getting past that and worrying about the future, being concerned that we will leave something for our children's children's children, rather than devastating the planet, we're not going to do that unless we understand the authoritarian relationship, stop worshipping gurus, and start electing politicians who care for a change rather than the horrible narcissists that we tend to put in charge of us. And there's no party political thing for me there. I have no political affiliation. As far as I can see, there are a few politicians who are the best of people, but there are certainly quite a lot of politicians who are the worst of people. And so we need to understand that. And I mean, as you well know, the book I've written about it is Opening Our Minds, Avoiding Abusive Relationships and Authoritarian Groups. And when Michael Langone, who was then the head of the International Cultic Studies Association, read the book a few years ago, he said, nobody's ever done this before. That you've not just taken cults, taken all of the places where this psychology exists, this coercive psychology is used, and shown it's the same thing that's being used. It's not complicated. It's quite straightforward. But for some reason, apart from the course you did at Salford University with Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall, there is no other master's course on this subject.
That's right. That's right.
So
and that's why it's so important.
And
yeah, and that's why we promote it so much.
Yeah, I haven't made a T-shirt yet, but the book is available in print as an ebook, and there's even a version of me reading it. And I, it'd be good to have that conversation to get that out into the world. So I would like, the devotees and followers that we've created through this program to now go out on street corners and sell worn copies of my books until such time as I become the richest man in the world. And
there we go.
That's evidently my purpose.
There we go. You will sell the books. You
will sell the books.
Yes. Well, as
and Chris's books too.
Yeah, this is important stuff, and I agree with John. I think that we have that old those who okay, hop down, buddy. Hop down. Thank you. We have Benson. That old yeah, exactly. He got in the room here, so I'm gonna have to snip that out. We have that old saying in history, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I sort of varied that up a little bit with those who don't know history are doomed to be assholes.
But curiously, Jim Jones had it above his throne at Jonestown, the Santayana quote. It's like, I wanted to throw in, because we found the source of it, this thing that's attributed to Voltaire.
Oh yeah,
people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities. Yep. Voltaire never said that.
Nope.
But it has been. It was said. It was said by Radhakrishnan, who was the second Premier of India. And the thought that a man as brilliant as Radhakrishnan was the Premier of India, and that we now have Narendra Modi, who is just, I think, one of the worst people in history, running the largest democracy and showing that people will vote for somebody who believes in massacring Muslims as a part of the project, the so-called pink revolution in India at the moment. But people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities. And to not believe absurdities means you're going to have to think, you're going to have to find your way through and come to a principle for me that says we are pro-human.
Right.
We are for humanity, and those people that are against any segment of humanity, race, creed, color, nation, any of this thing, they're in the wrong, and they have the wrong view.
That's right.
And
that's right. That's the world we've got to create that world. And we're only going to get there if we understand ourselves so that we can overcome our weaknesses, basically. Yeah. And that's what this show is about. That's what we talk about all the time, because we're talking about people out there who are not only not interested in dealing with or solving our problems, but use our problems and use our emotional states and use these problems to control us further and make it worse.
To prey upon us and devastate our environment. These are the true suppressive people, of whom, when I got a letter from Richard DeMille, who wrote Science of Survival from Hubbard's notes, and 2 other books as well of Hubbard's, and was the son of the adopted son of Cecil B. DeMille, the great film director, in fact, a blood nephew. But he wrote me a letter. He was also a professor of psychology for a while. He wrote me a letter after reading Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, and he was very grateful that I'd observed that L. Ron Hubbard was the archetypal suppressive person.
Yes.
Having,
Exactly.
he knew him very well. So,
Exactly.
well, there we are. We have exhausted all of our audience now. They're all kind of, oh, will this ever end? It's like listening to the rituals before a Roman 3 days of. Oh.
Well,
we are coming to a conclusion, I promise.
No, we'll wrap up now. John, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you. It's been great, as ever.
Yeah, it's always fun. And I hope you guys out there, entertaining, enjoyable, entertaining, informative, and educational. That is the goal here. Thank you very much for coming around and listening to us blabber on. We hope you got something out of this. And I'll see you next week.
Yep. And let us know in the comments.
That's right.
See you, bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
You will sell the books. You
We'll
will sell the books.